to our Politics on the Edge lecture series on the topic tonight of the new conservatism. And some of you may be thinking, what does conservatism have to do with edginess? Isn't conservatism, after all, kind of stayed and stole it or what have you? But we who put together this event think otherwise. We thought that there is, in fact, some edginess at stake today in new conservative movements. For one thing, we're increasingly aware that traditional conservatives have been on the margins or on the edges of the Republican Party during the Trump presidency. And from a different angle, insofar as conservative discourses lately have been about reclaiming the center, I think we're increasingly aware that the center itself has its own potential kind of edge, that the center need not only be a muted kind of politics between the far right and the far left, but can be a kind of impassioned reaction, a radical reaction against the hyperpolarization that is besetting American democracy today. So for these two reasons, the way in which conservatives have been marginalized in the Republican Party, some of them at least, and the way in which the conservatives in the guise of centrists may be a location from which to push back strongly in a radical way against polarization, we thought there is a place for talking about the new conservatism in our Politics on the Edge series. Now, this series is held in conjunction with the Philomathean Society at Penn, and we're very proud of the Mitchell Center to be working together with Philo. This is our 8th event overall with Philo, and it's our 4th year together putting on this lecture series. I want to thank Kelly McGarrigle, who will be our main moderator of the discussion. She's a student at the college at Penn and one of the leaders of the Philomathean Society. And before turning things over to her, let me just also thank the SNF Paideia Program, whose sponsorship has helped to make our discussion tonight possible. And they are continuing the conversation about conservatism tomorrow evening, when at 7:30 p.m., they'll be hosting an event entitled The Future of Conservatism with Kristen Soltis-Anderson, Jonathan Last, and Olivia Troy. So we look forward to that discussion as well. Let me now turn things over to you, Kelly.
Awesome, thank you so much. So on behalf of the Philomathean Society of the University of Pennsylvania and the entire 541st Cabinet, I am honored as our second censor to welcome you and all of our people viewing this discussion today to this 8th Politics on the Edge panel. So this is a collaboration between Philo, which is the oldest student organization at Penn and the oldest literary society in the United States, founded in 1813 with 13 members, and the Andrea Mitchell Center for the Study of Democracy and SNF Paideia Program. So tonight we're going to be discussing how conservatism can and should remake itself after Trump in a moderated discussion with William Kristol and Sarah Longwell, the founders of Defending Democracy Together, among a list of other accomplishments that I'm going to describe in a second. They're going to be discussing, now that Trump has exited the White House, what is the path towards a true post-Trump era? What conservative politics, will conservative politics embrace the norms of American democracy again, and what challenges may stand in the way? So before we begin, I just want to sketch a brief biography of our two speakers for those unfamiliar. So for 3 decades, William Kristol has been a leading participant in American political debates and a widely respected analyst of American political developments. Kristol has served in senior positions in the Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush administrations and has taught at Penn and at Harvard. Kristol founded the Weekly Standard in 1995, edited the influential magazine for over 2 decades. Now, as founding director of Defending Democracy Together, an organization dedicated to defending America's liberal democratic norms, principles, and institutions, Kristol is in the midst of the national debate on issues ranging from American foreign policy to the future of the Republican Party, which we're discussing tonight, and the meaning of American conservatism for the new millennium. Sarah Longwell is the president and CEO of Longwell Partners, a full-service communications firm in Washington, D.C., which focuses on solving some of the country's most intractable problems through cross-partisan coalitions. So, Longwell is a co-founder of Defending Democracy Together, spokeswoman for its project, Republicans for the Rule of Law, and executive director of the newly launched Republican Accountability Project. She is also the publisher of The Bulwark. So this is going to be a webinar discussion. Viewers have submitted some questions beforehand, which I have a list of. And if anyone wants to submit questions during the discussion, please use the Q&A function, and we'll make sure that those questions get asked. They can address questions of the conservative past, present, or future, or any questions that you think that these two panelists will be uniquely suited to answer. And now for the first question of the night, Jeff Green of the Andrea Mitchell Center is going to start us off with a discussion about conservatism generally.
Thank you, Kelly. Yes, we thought we'd start on a philosophical plane here with a quote from Michael Oakeshott from 1962 and his definition of conservatism, and ask the speakers if they had any reactions to that quote and what conservatism ultimately means to them. So Oakeshott writes in 1962, I put it for you all to see in the chat, that it's the inclination to enjoy what is present as core to the conservative disposition, to enjoy what is present. What is esteemed, Oakeshott writes, is the present, and it is esteemed not on account of its connections with the remote antiquity, nor because it is recognized to be more admirable than any possible alternative, but on account of its familiarity. And then Oakeshott adds, it is a disposition appropriate to a man who is acutely aware of having something to lose, which he has learned to care for, a man in some degree rich in opportunities for enjoyment, but not so rich that he can afford to be indifferent to loss. Then comes probably the most quoted passage in this essay. To be conservative then is to prefer the familiar to the unknown, to prefer the tried to the untried, fact to mystery, the actual to the possible, the limited to the unbounded, the convenient to the perfect, present laughter to utopian bliss. Familiar relationships and loyalties will be preferred to the allure of more profitable attachments. To acquire and to enlarge will be less important than to keep, to cultivate and to enjoy. The grief of loss will be more acute than the excitement of novelty or promise. So we thought we could start things off here and get your reactions to Oakeshott's definition of the conservative. Thank you.
Maybe I'll go first, since I once knew something about this, having taught political theory back in the day at Penn, and it's great to be back at Penn, if only virtually. I'd love to actually come back. I will come back at some point, I trust. We will reassemble there at 36th Street or whatever, and it would be nice to visit again. I did teach political theory at Penn. I don't know that I taught Oakeshott. So Oakeshott this is his most famous essay, I think, and his most famous book, a book of essays called Rationalism in Politics. It affected me some in grad school when I read it, because it's a critique, just to put it in its perspective. He's British, and it's a very Burkean, you might say, but even more Burkean than Burke, kind of critique of rationalism, of planning, of the scientific method, of trying to, not appreciate what tradition has given you. And as Oakeshott says, there's a sense that you will lose more than you gain by experimentation, novelty is overrated, etc. I think it's a very British point of view, a certain kind of British conservatism that's been very powerful for a long time. I was struck when I read it, though. I'm an American conservative, and American conservatism looks back to the American founding. Conservatism usually looks back to the beginning of a nation. And the American founding, of course, was new. I mean, it was a founding. It was based on a new political science. It was based on a revolution. And I have always found Oakeshott's work, I mean, you can learn a lot from it. He did scholarly work on Hobbes and stuff, which I think is important. But his work is it's not quite my kind of conservatism. I think I'm too American, really, to be an Oakeshottian. And I think in this moment, we can lament in an Oakeshottian way what we've lost, and we can look back to a healthier kind of conservatism that was less populist and less revolutionary and more attached to settled ways. But the trouble is, once you've sort of destroyed those settled ways, it's hard to, you can't just sort of wish them back into being. So I think, and I'll let Sarah pick up here. I mean, I think the task ahead of us, it's a task to restore what's good about conservatism, but it's not really a conservative task in Oakeshott's sense. It's not so much about kind of hanging on to we've treasured. It's a lot of it is a rebuilding or a building anew, much more in the spirit, I would say, of the American founders.
Yeah, and I guess I would only add that when I came to conservatism, a big part of it was the idea that you wanted to conserve what was good, right? You didn't, and I do think that there's something temperamentally about conservatives that resonates in terms of the Oakeshott. Well, like, we don't like unintended consequences. You will hear conservatives talk about unintended consequences all the time, and we do have a disposition towards, if you're going to change an institution, maybe either don't do it or do it slowly. And so there's certainly elements of that, but I agree with Bill that it is not sort of a complete and total rootedness to everything that is, and a complete unwillingness to think about what might be. I mean, even if you just think about it in terms of conservatism, which has been pretty much married to kind of a robust and free economic system. You know, we believe in innovation, we believe in building things. And so I don't think it quite fits whether it's an American version or a contemporary version of conservatism. But it was still a very interesting quote. And I learned that in the before chat that it's the kind of idea where, you know, if progressives come in and say something like, well, we're reevaluating something like Thanksgiving because maybe in its roots it's you know, it's got some troubling things, that a conservative, there would be a disposition towards saying, no, that's a thing that we enjoy, that's an important institution, we don't want and it would be sort of, it would not be entertained. And I could see it in terms of something like that.
Just curious, you mentioned what originally drew you to the conservative movement. I was hoping that you guys could actually discuss that a little bit. What drew you to the conservative movement, perhaps over the liberal movement or over a moderate movement? What was that initial attraction like? Were there any, like, I guess, did you switch between parties at any point? What was the journey towards who you are today in terms of political ideology like? I know that's a long question because you guys have incredible careers that have covered an incredible amount of accomplishments, but if you could just speak generally for the young people in the audience about how your path was towards becoming a conservative.
Sarah, you go.
Okay. You know, I came to conservatism. So my parents are I think both pretty conservative. My mom put Thomas Sowell in my hands when I was in high school. And honestly, I had a very liberal history professor, sort of all 4 years of high school, to whom I am deeply attached and love very much. But he and I just were at loggerheads. I think part of it is I grew up in central Pennsylvania, very small town in central Pennsylvania. And I was sort of culturally conservative. I grew up around guns. And then I went to a private school for high school that was much more liberal. And I think I just found some of the values that I'd grown up with sort of clashing with what was a new, I would call it kind of an elite liberal mentality. And because I was so argumentative, I began to sort of feed the part of me that could debate this professor, and became sort of more and more interested in conservative ideas. I think I do like, you know, I think I am not wild about radical change, just to change things, or the idea of sort of, I would find the notion that we might want to think about canceling Thanksgiving to be, I would not respond well to that idea. I didn't even know that was a thing until somebody told me prior to this. And so, you know, but a lot of it was just economic policy. I never liked the idea that I sort of viewed liberals, especially in my younger days, as the idea was, if you just gave people more stuff, then they'll vote for you. And I didn't always view that as the most serious politics. I kind of always looked at Republicans, especially, I was in high school around the Clinton era, and, you know, he was having an affair with a woman who was just a few years older than I was. The Republican Party were the ones talking about, it's funny in retrospect, they were the ones talking about the rule of law and about, you know, character counting and decency mattering. And all of those things were compelling to me and stood in contrast to what I saw the Democrats as when I was, you know, 18, 19 years old. Now, my views have obviously evolved a great deal over time, but I will say that idea that character counts and that decency matters were things that attracted me then. And they're one of the reasons that I have so much trouble with the current Republican Party.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a generation older than Sarah, maybe even a little more. So a very different experience in high school in New York City in the late 60s. But I think what we probably have in common is a kind of contrarian streak that led us to not quite want to go along with my teachers were all liberals at a private school on the Upper West Side of New York. And my classmates were all on the left, and it was the new left, so they were beyond liberals. A lot of them were actual kind of, they thought they were radicals. I mean, they were actually, you know, upper middle class kids from Manhattan, but they enjoyed playing at being radicals. And I found all that a little sort of off-putting, and just when I listened to the arguments, unconvincing. I guess in that respect, I did have something of a natural conservative streak, like Oakeshott maybe, in an Oakeshottian way of just sort of thinking I don't know, this is kind of a great country. We won World War II. We came out of the Depression. My grandparents came over here with nothing and from a persecuted under authoritarianism and cherished this country, and their children, my parents, did pretty well and well enough to have a comfortable middle class lifestyle in New York. And, and there's freedom of thought and freedom of speech and a chance to start a business if that's what you want to do. And that stuff shouldn't just be scorned or thrown away. And of course, we have terrible injustices. This was also the middle of the civil rights movement. And I thought, okay, we're addressing those and that's in a good way, but let's do it through the laws and through peaceful disobedience if necessary, but not through trashing all our institutions. So I sort of rebelled against the new left of the late 60s, I would say. And I originally was more of a, sort of centrist liberal against the left. I was for Hubert Humphrey when I was 15 for president, not for Gene McCarthy, who was the favorite of the left, but not for McGovern in 72. I was for Scoop Jackson. So I was kind of a conservative Democrat at that time. And then that part of the party kind of went away. And I became, by 1980, I was when I was teaching at Penn, actually, I was a Reagan Republican. So I think that was a pretty large part of it. You'd like to believe that you have the views you have because you read all these books or thought these things through deeply, but a lot of it is an instinctive reaction to your circumstances at first. Hopefully you then think it through and you might change your views. Some, and I have too, but, and I think my reaction was pretty strongly against my peers really in the late 60s. I got along with them personally, of course, but I mean, against their way of thinking about things in the late 60s in New York City.
So we've discussed a few different generations of conservatism. I'm part of Generation Z. I was born in 2000. I'm just curious, Generation Z, according to the Pew Research Center, is by some estimations the most liberal generation ever, especially on social issues, with a great desire for environmental protections, LGBTQ plus rights, gender equality, reproductive rights, etc. The list goes on. I'm just curious, how do you believe social conservatism will change for this generation? Will it change, and should it change? Because from the peers that I've talked to, the aspects of social conservatism are what draw them away from the Republican Party, since they disagree with a lot of the perspectives on civil rights, on women's rights, on LGBT rights. So what role do you think social conservatism has to play in addressing the concerns of Generation Z and the millennials as well?
How is social conservatism? It doesn't surprise me that would be a roadblock to people. It was a bit of an impediment to me. I was a big believer in marriage equality, for example, when I was sort of younger, conservative. And I think social conservatism has changed quite a bit to be, more. I think there's a lot of people who still believe in traditional marriage, but I think, the Republican Party, and to be clear, being a conservative and being part of the Republican Party aren't necessarily exactly the same things. But, Donald Trump was socially, I don't think there's anybody who really buys the idea that he's a big pro-life activist. And so, his socially conservative bona fides were in real doubt. And so I do think that, the way that social conservatism sort of dominated the Republican worldview in the early aughts, which is when I was coming up in the conservative movement, I would say that has changed quite a bit. I think one of the social issues that remains pretty steadfast and maybe has even picked up some ground is the pro-life movement. I think you still find people quite split on that issue. I haven't seen any recent polling for Generation Z, but oftentimes as women get older, they become more socially conservative, or both men and women as they get older, they become slightly, their views on that issue evolve. And so that is one that I think remains kind of a deeply entrenched cultural thing that divides people. I also think one of the things that is interesting to me is watching the sort of conservative movement when I was coming up. Its entire orientation on social issues was against gay marriage. That was like what the whole debate was about. Rick Santorum, entire politicians' careers were launched against gay marriage. And like most of that stuff's over, but there is now a pretty healthy, you hear a lot of the Ben Shapiros, the people who are considered, thought leaders in the conservative movement, now spend a lot of time on trans issues. Like they've just sort of moved to a new marginalized community that I think that they speak about with and I think that there are real debates that people can have in good faith, but obviously a lot of it sort of comes with sort of a mocking and derision that is not helpful in having like a real debate about, whether or not somebody who was born biologically male, but has become a woman, like, should they participate in women's sports? I think that is a legitimate conversation for people and debate for people to have. But I think that, refusing to call people by their preferred gender just to be spiteful is not particularly helpful. And you see a lot of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's well said. And just to get back to Oakeshott, with whom we began, he was a traditionalist, but he also would have been the first to say, and did say, that traditions change. And part of being a conservative is not being a reactionary and not trying to, you can resist change, the foolish change is imposed on above, but if society is changing, if culture is changing, Oakeshott was quite accepting of that. And Andrew Sullivan is in fact probably the most well-known sort of Oakeshottian, I think he would call himself that. And I don't think he was too young to have studied with Oakeshott, but he was influenced by Oakeshott very much in his studies, and one of the leading early advocates, obviously, of marriage equality, and really made the argument in a kind of conservative way, that, look, these people want to get married and it's not going to hurt anyone else. And maybe it seemed, just out of the question 20 or 30 years before, but it's not out of the question now. So what's the real argument against it? I think social conservatism changes and will change. To answer your question, has to change. And I would distinguish a kind of serious social conservatism, often grounded in religion. I'd say today very concerned about religious liberty questions, which are not foolish and which have to be balanced with other claims of equality and justice. I think there are some honest, difficult judgment calls there, and the courts are grappling with them, and legislatures too, obviously. So I think the House maybe has already passed the equality bill that the Democrats had introduced, but I've seen even some liberal law professors, including one quite well known who was at the forefront of the fight for marriage equality, says, let's be careful that we don't need to get rid of the Religious Freedom Registration Act as much as this bill does, that we can balance a kind of, some religions are going to want to maintain distinctions among sexes or held to their traditional teaching in schools and so forth, and that could affect their hiring of the teachers. And that's a tough call, honestly. Do you want people to discriminate on that? No. On the other hand, if it's a court of religion that certain things be taught, if it's a religious school, should they be able to? Obviously, they can influence what's taught, presumably. Can they influence who's hired? I think that's not such an obvious, question if you think about how a free society should work. So I think that's kind of where the debate has moved. I think it's very important that the debate be conducted in a civil way and in a decent way. Federalism can help with this. Different places could come up with slightly different balances. But unfortunately, our politics is so hyper-partisan and so overheated, it's hard to have a civil debate these days. But I would distinguish all of those concerns, religion and sort of, traditions, let's say, from the kind of Trumpian version of social conservatism, which often really is mocking people of other ethnicities or minorities or people who are unpopular for some reason or who haven't been in the past treated as fully equal members of the community, and a kind of hostility to these people, instead of saying, well, okay, let's be careful as we move forward in this form of progress, not to get rid of or damage anything else with unintended consequences and so forth. And I do think that there's a pretty big difference between a kind of healthy respect for tradition and just a kind of bitterness towards the new and hostility to something that wasn't around 20 or 40 or 60 years ago, and then a kind of really ridiculous nostalgia for a time that probably wasn't so great, and these people themselves wouldn't want to go back to it, but somehow, we've got everything is now terrible because of, I don't know what, because of progressivism or something. So it's not a very good time for these debates in the public sphere right now, but we have had, we should be able to manage them.
Thank you. I have a question from the audience for Sarah. This is from Brian Rosenwald. You do a lot of focus grouping, and I'm wondering what you're seeing in terms of attitudes towards conservatism and the Republican Party, especially among women. So I guess focusing in a little bit on more of that social liberalism. So just your
Hey,
perspective.
Brian. So I do. I as part of the project that Bill and I launched together, going around 2017, 2018, I started to do focus groups because I sort of didn't understand what was going on in our own party. I don't think a lot of us who saw kind of everybody opposed Trump, and then suddenly everybody kind of their bodies got snatched and they were suddenly all in for Trump. And we were trying to understand how, Trump had won this sort of narrow plurality of voters, but because there was such a crowded field, he was able to. So we didn't feel for a while like Trump actually represented the Republican Party, but we wanted to talk to voters to understand why had they voted for Trump and what, like what was going on with the Republican Party. And what did I learn specifically about women? I did hundreds of these focus groups, so I'm not sure how much time you have. Look, I'll say a few things that became very clear from the focus groups. One is the way in which our politics is now much more about something that it would be political science termed negative polarity or negative polarization, which is that the way that a lot of these folks talk about politics is not, like they'll say, I didn't vote for Trump, I voted against Hillary Clinton. It is, they have a very difficult time articulating why they're a Republican, like what are the policy ideas, and they don't really think of themselves as conservatives. They think of, for the most, like a passive observer of politics, they are culturally Republican. And they think of themselves as Republican in the sense that they've always voted Republican, they're married to a Republican, their parents are Republicans. And what they know is that they don't like the Democrats, and they can tell you quite a bit about why they don't like Democrats. They can't tell you as much about what it is about Republican policies or politics or politicians that would make them affirmatively Republican. And I think that's really come through actually as something that's going on with the Republican Party. It's something I talk about a lot about, when the Republican, they put forward a platform, as they do with every convention last year. The platform said, it put forward, usually parties put forward a platform that's like, here are all the things we stand for. And it's pages and pages and pages. Here's our position on this, here's our position on that. The Republican Party just didn't put out a platform. They just said, we are for Donald Trump. He is our leader. And it was the most telling and sort of on the nose metaphor for what is going on with the Republican Party. And I think that that's reflected by a lot of these voters. They just say, look, Democrats are socialists, or Joe Biden is weak, and so that's why I had to vote for this, Republican over here. I will say, I think that for a lot of, I heard from a lot of women who were Republican for religious reasons. They're very pro-life. And it was interesting over the summer, I did see a real evolution in the way that they talked about the idea of being pro-life, and that being pro-life was starting to mean something different to them, not just, wanting to protect babies in the womb, but also the idea that Black Lives Matter, the idea that you should protect elderly people during this pandemic. Like there was kind of a wholesale rethinking going on, especially with women around, and I do think around race in general, which was interesting. It was just interesting to see.
I guess that I actually have a follow-up for both of you guys from the chat as well. This one is an anonymous attendee, so it could be anyone. But what role do you think that race has played in the formation and evolution of the current Republican Party?
That's a much debated topic and much discussed by historians and political scientists. Obviously, the party started out as an anti-slavery party. It was a northern party. The Democrats controlled the South. I'm just old enough to remember the solid, not really remember, but remember people talking about, I guess, the solid South, and which was solidly Democratic, for decades. And Roosevelt, in a slightly less politically correct time, honestly, liberal political scientists would talk admiringly about how FDR had put together the New Deal coalition, which they mostly approved of course. I don't disapprove of either, but which consisted of sort of labor unions in the North, a lot of farmers in the Midwest and the Plain States, and the South and segregationists in the South. I mean, a lot of the most famous New Deal senators were pretty, unfortunately, not just segregationists, but racists, and that coalition hung together a long time. That was a matter of politics. It was very impressive that Roosevelt was able to put it together. It probably delayed, honestly, progress in civil rights for a while. But then, of course, everything flipped. Goldwater opposed the Civil Rights Act in '64. I think not, and he wasn't racially bigoted, but he had excessive concerns, perhaps, about limited government and all this. I mean, he had been one of the founders of the NAACP in Arizona in the '50s, but I believe. But and then gradually the Republican Party everything reversed. The Republican Party became the Southern Party. The Democrats became the really party to which African Americans were loyal and really loyal, 90% loyal, and still, basically. I mean, that's been one of the longest stretches of any racial group or ethnic group sticking with a party in sort of American political history. And I do think Republicans deserve some blame for that, because I think a lot of decent people thought, look, we want to have more African American voters, but we do believe in some of these, in limited government in certain ways, and we believe in economic growth, and that requires, capitalism, and we can't be the party of welfare. A lot of that was tinged with racial appeal. Some of it was explicitly racial, but a lot of it was kind of I'd say more of a lack of concern for the well-being of African Americans, or a lack of appreciation for the challenges they faced, more than hostility. Some of the crime rhetoric was hostile, but crime was also a real problem. I do think a lot of people, I would put myself in this category, really didn't, though. There has been a lot of rethinking, as Sarah mentioned this, in the context of sort of Black Lives Matter and the kind of almost pro-life way of thinking about things. But I would say on the police issue in particular, I just feel personally that, I mean, I've been around and I, watch politics pretty closely in public policy, but I really didn't appreciate the degree to which African Americans just were treated differently, and therefore had a different view of police and policing, and that had to be taken seriously. It wasn't just that, it's, a little inconvenient for them, or even, it was a much deeper problem. So I think there's been a lot of change, actually. I think it's a pretty fluid moment in terms of our thinking about race. And in the Republican Party, now with Trump, that got very complicated. He had a certain appeal, of course, to African Americans. I think, got a slight increase in vote among, especially African American men. They liked certain aspects of his cultural kind of toughness, apparently. But obviously, on the whole, he was pretty, didn't do much, I would say, or didn't pay much respect to those efforts. And obviously with President Obama and then with President Biden, having been President Obama's vice president, there's an awful lot of ability to appeal to Black Americans. I do think this is one place where the Biden administration is important. I've said generally, we all tend to talk about Trump, and understandably, and about conservatism, and that's the topic of this evening, and I think your evening tomorrow. But I mean, Joe Biden is probably of all the new presidents we have, what is he now, a month in? He's probably gotten the least attention of any new president. Normally, I've been in Washington for several transitions. New president comes in. Oh, what's he doing here? Who's in his cabinet? Who's up? Who's down? What's the legislative tactics? There's been a little bit of that, obviously, on the pandemic relief bill, and is near attending going to be confirmed for OMB and so forth. But I mean, Trump has been such a dominant issue, and I think properly so, because he is an unusual president. I mean, an authoritarian, nativist demagogue, and what the after effects of that are, that's a huge question for American democracy. And in some way, and when the future of the Republican Party is a huge question, and in some ways, whether the Joe Biden administration is, where exactly on the spectrum it is between being centrist and center left a little more to the left, doesn't matter as much. Having said all that, in the actual history of the country, it's going to matter whether Joe Biden is a successful president in general, in my opinion. Whether you can, because I think it would be very healthy for the country to have a successful presidency that does represent more than 45% of the country and really tries to advance policies that help everyone. And I do think on race in particular, he could be very important. If Biden can govern in a way that seems to knit together some of the wounds that were opened up, that does really assure Black Americans that their concerns or interests are being taken seriously, but also reassures white Americans that they're not somehow just being thrown under the bus or off the bus or whatever, and that they don't have to, I don't know, apologize for their race either, and for being proud of what their immigrant ancestors did, perhaps. If he could really, if we could end up in a much healthier place after 4 years or 8 years of a Biden administration, Biden-Harris administration, that would be a very good thing. So I actually think on race, we're at a pretty fluid but important moment.
You know, I'll just add just something quickly, which is that there's also the way that Donald Trump used race in terms of immigrant communities, right? And immigration specifically. Like Trump's big thing, the thing that sort of catapulted him to stardom within the Republican Party was this idea that he's going to build a wall. And, you know, we are now going to have this very isolationist, America first policy toward immigration, which is very different. And I would just say, to strike a positive tone about when I was growing up, Republicans, like there's a great famous debate that if you haven't seen, you should go watch, between H.W. Bush and Reagan, where they are trying to outdo each other to say who can say the nicer things about immigrants. These are hardworking people who have risked a lot to come to this country. They are the best among us, and we should help to make sure that they thrive here. I mean, it is just a stark contrast to the way that Donald Trump used immigrants as a wedge issue, frankly, to gin up voters who didn't even live in communities with many immigrants whatsoever. And so Donald Trump absolutely used race as a wedge issue among Americans, and frankly, I think stole from the Republican Party, but more so America, one of its greatest achievements, which is that anybody can come to America from anywhere and become an American. And that is not a thing that happens other places. And I think that the new nativism that we are seeing, which of course is on the rise all over the world, it's not just the United States. The United States, it's scarier here because we believe we are all immigrants, and immigration is like, it's in our being. It's who we are. It's what makes us awesome. And it's also what makes us most uniquely suited to positively deal with these racial issues that are obviously omnipresent and difficult, and we have to grapple with them, and there's been all kinds of failures, but we can do it the best. We can get to a better place because we are institutionally built for it, built for, taking a bunch of people from different backgrounds and different walks of life and uniting them under a common banner of Americanism. And that was, to me, one of the things early on. I mean, I was out on Trump from the beginning, but one of the things early on was this idea that he did where he was really trying to pit both Americans against each other and against our American ideals of sort of being a welcoming, shining city on a hill.
Yeah, if I can just add one thing too, I think that's really right. And I mean, one reason I remain pretty confident about the country and don't think Trumpism is the future is your generation, Gen Z, but also millennials. I mean, younger people in general. I've just seen each generation how much more comfortable they are with diversity than my generation was. And our generation is a heck of a lot more comfortable than, 30 years, 50 years before us. So I don't see why that progress really shouldn't continue. And I'm teaching a study group now at Harvard, and just watching, it's on Zoom, unfortunately, but watching the students interact, I don't see, maybe I'm missing it. Of course, I'm just seeing them for a couple of hours a day, so I don't see everything that's going on behind the scenes, and they're not in dorms and so forth. But I feel like an awful lot of people from an awfully diverse group of set of backgrounds are getting along fine, not thinking about it actually quite often, and treating each other as individuals and as in a decent way. So in that respect, I'm pretty optimistic. Now, having a demagogue who heightens racial and ethnic divisions, though, can do a lot of damage. I don't think it's not clear. And so far, I think most of that damage, frankly, has been done with people in my generation, where they were sort of halfway there and accepting diversity, halfway nostalgic for a sort of different America that they kind of miss for some reason. Maybe some good reasons, in the sense that they haven't done so well in the new America or whatever, because of the globalization and economic forces and other things. And Trump just whipped them up in a way to emphasize all the grievances and all the anxieties and all the resentments, and to downplay all the benefits and the sort of happier future that could be ahead. And that can do a lot of damage. And, you know, we can all say, well, ultimately it can't succeed, but you can, you know, it's a long way from here to ultimately, and an awful lot of people's lives can be hurt, unfortunately, in between. And that's what's worried me so much about Trump. But I do feel that young people are a bit of a barrier to that attempt to whip up nativism and bigotry.
So I'm going to change topics a little bit. At Penn, I'm an international relations major. I spend a lot of time focusing on foreign policy. So I really liked this question from Andrew Blinkensop. I apologize if I mispronounced your name. He asked, do you think that Trump's election represented a repudiation of the neoconservative approach to foreign policy within the Republican base? And then following up, should U.S. military primacy and muscular intervention be part of the Republican foreign policy identity in the coming years? So direct interventions with military.
Bill, that sounds like a question tailor-made for you.
Okay, yeah, well, I think it should be part of of America. I mean, I remain kind of an unrepentant internationalist, globalist, and pretty hawkish one, you know, when necessary, obviously not most of the time. I think we underestimate how much good the liberal world order has done for us and for billions of people around the world. And if you know, it's got its problems, but the last 70 years have been a heck of a lot better than the first 50 years of the 20th century. And, you know, a world without, in which billions of people came out of poverty in China and India, and in which there's been relative minimization of armed conflict and of terrible things, kinds of things that happened in the first half of the 20th century. I think we don't give that enough. You know, we take that for granted a little bit, and we don't give ourselves enough credit for helping construct that order and maintain it. Sometimes a considerable sacrifice, sometimes with mistakes, obviously, but it's worth paying some attention to maintaining it. I'd say you don't know how bad things can get until they start to get bad. It's, you know, so I'm very much of a. For me, it's not really a party matter. I mean, I began as a kind of democratic, liberal internationalist. I became a Reagan Republican internationalist, but we started the Weekly Standard magazine in 1995. Fred Barnes, John Harris, David Brooks, me, a few others. And Bill Clinton intervened in Bosnia in, I think it was December of 95. Quite controversial, opposed by probably a majority of Republicans on the Hill. And we supported Clinton's intervention. I remember all the people canceling subscriptions to the Weekly Standard, and this is slightly pre-December 95, so it's slightly pre-email for most people, and getting, therefore, you know, typed and handwritten letters actually coming into the office by snail mail saying, I didn't subscribe to this magazine, it's supposed to be a conservative magazine, in order to read editorials defending Bill Clinton, you know. So it was like an early moment of polarization, you know, and hyperpartisanship. But so for me, it really should, at best, it would be a bipartisan view. Yes, Trump's victory certainly was a repudiation. It was mostly about other things, to be honest, but it was part of it's certainly the importance of the things that seemed important to John McCain, to Mitt Romney, to Reagan, to Bush, both Bushes, weren't important to Trump, and turned out not to be that important to the voters. Whether they just took what the world we have for granted. Trump played on some resentments about trade, obviously. But I don't think it was really I don't think it was a fundamental change. I don't think it's impossible for Republicans to nominate a sort of an internationalist in 2024. I think the Biden administration shows that there's a fair amount of support for that among Democrats, and I don't think it really hurt Biden in the general election that he didn't want to pull our troops out of everywhere and wanted to maintain our alliance structure and so forth. So I think Americans understand what the world would look like the world's tricky already in managing the rise of China. There are a million things going on, but what the world would look like if we just step back, I think a lot of Americans understand that would not be a happy prospect.
I mean, one of the things that I find sort of remarkable is that, so I graduated from college in 2002. So I was a junior in college when 9/11 happened. And so I spent my early years in politics or policy adjacent with the Republican Party that was, you know, very much in favor of Iraq and Afghanistan, and where that was like the dominant issue sort of animating the party. And so the foreign policy element was top of mind and the biggest part of what people debated. What's amazing to me now as I look at is just how much Republicans sort of act like that was never a thing. Like they were never, like the Republican Party has changed in this way of, you know, that it was one of the things, I think Jeb Bush literally could get nowhere in a Republican primary because Donald Trump very easily could tie him to his brother and the Iraq War. And I just think that ended up being, and the fact that Donald Trump wasn't a politician at that time and had been like critical of the Iraq War did give him, it was part of, it's not everything, it wasn't even the tip of the spear, but it was kind of rolled into his populist message, where he tapped into something that I actually was sort of surprised by, where like you kind of can't find anybody now in the Republican Party who will say like, yes, I'm an interventionist and I believe we should have we should be a leader in the world. And that I just was surprised how many Americans were like, yeah, pull out of NATO. Like, not Americans, Republicans. Like it does feel like a wholesale shift in some way for a party over the course of a decade to change that much in sort of how it orients itself in relationship to foreign policy, which is one of the reasons that I think, it is good that the Democrats nominated Joe Biden. There is sort of still somebody who is an adult who recognizes that their alliances matter and that the world order is not a given, and recognizes the role that America plays. And you don't even have to be super interventionist or hawkish to believe that, but it does take sort of some grownups to say, you know what? You can't just offer to give Kim Jong-un a lift on Air Force One. Like, that's not okay. That's not, we're not going to side against America's intelligence community while standing on the stage next to Vladimir Putin. Like, that's not what we do. And those were, of course, all the things Donald Trump did. So I welcome the return of people who take foreign policy as seriously as it ought to be taken.
That's, I think, a good point. I probably understate, in a way, the importance of Trump's shift in response to that interesting question. But I'll just a footnote to what Sarah was saying. I remember when Trump used the term America First, and that became his slogan, really, and that was pretty early, and that was 2015, he came out with that. And it became clear he didn't really know the history, of course, of America, the America First Committee, and what the details of Lindbergh in 1940 and 1941 and so forth. But he was willing to identify with that. I remember thinking that he can't, he must just be sort of a mistake, or he'll change. He can't really want to go down that road, and surely other people aren't going to let him go down that road. That's a pretty disreputable effort, honestly, really with more than overtones of anti-Semitism, and certainly flat out. Think of it. Hitler is running Germany. Kristallnacht has happened. The invasion of the annexation of Austria has happened. The invasion of Poland has happened. The war with Britain has. The invasion of France, the Netherlands, Belgium, and France has happened by May of 1940. The bombing of London, and fine. There's a party in America. There's a group in America that wants to stay out, and even Roosevelt sort of wanted to stay out for a while. But they're proud of staying out, and they have contempt for people who want to get involved and maybe save the world or save Europe from Hitler. That's what America First was. It wasn't just like, gee, it's very complicated and difficult. It was, we have disdain for those people, and we're going to actually attack them in quite nasty ways, who want to get us in. They just want to get in because they want to make money off munitions, or they're Jews who care about their Jewish counterparts in Europe and so forth. And this is, again, way after 1938, 39, and even 1940, goes into 41. And in fact, that's the height of it, I think. And I just thought, well, that would be repulsive to people. They don't want that. And I have been, as Sarah was sort of saying, a little bit shocked that that's sort of fine with everyone. Now, they don't really think hard about what exactly the analogy, they just use the term now because Trump uses it. Still, I wince every time I hear some Republican politician just kind of in a knee-jerk way say, yeah, we have to be America first. I think it's bad in even what it conveys today in terms of our allies and trade and other issues. But the historical resonance of it, I do think there was a reason both parties shied away from that for, 60 years, 70 years.
So I'm just going to follow up a little bit on something that y'all both were mentioning, and that's also referenced in questions from Adrian Basora and Glenn Magiola. Apologies if I mispronounce your names. I'm just curious, you've both mentioned the importance of the US as an internationalist power. I'm just curious what your roles are as an intervening power. Should we be intervening more? Should we be intervening more with our international partners? If we see abuses to democracy occurring in other nations, do we have a responsibility to invade at the risk of American lives? What is your opinion on like the balance between internationalism and interventionism?
I mean, I think it's very hard to have abstract rules for this, and no one ever has. And for all the talk about how, militant and interventionist we were, I mean, how many times did we intervene with Afghanistan, which I think was pretty much, there was consensus on that. Maybe we didn't have to stay as long as we did, but we certainly had to go in and clear out bin Laden. And then Iraq, that was the most controversial war. I supported it. I would still defend it. It was not fought well. They didn't have the weapons we thought they had, the weapons of mass destruction. It was fought badly. I was among those very, very critical of it early on in terms of the fighting of it. I was with McCain. We needed more troops. We needed a different strategy. When we got the more troops and a different strategy, we did have a decent, I think, outcome for a while at the end of 2008. But then we pulled out, and it's not so great now. It's still better than when Saddam was there. Syria is the non-interventionist test case. As many people dead, more people dead, really, I think, than in Iraq, and an incredible flow of migrants to Europe, which in turn was extremely disruptive of European politics and actually affected our politics here, if you were to think back to 2015 and those scenes of all the migrants in Germany and so forth. So, we've had difficulties with intervention and difficulties with non-intervention. For me, Rwanda in '94 was extremely important, where we did nothing. Sudan, where we let the UN handle it. Turns out they don't really handle it. Bosnia and Kosovo, where we did intervene, and where everyone said, "Oh, that's much too difficult, too complicated." It wasn't that complicated. It didn't require much, thank God, use of, too much use of American force, or loss of American life, or really others. And we stopped ethnic cleansing in Europe. So it's a balance, and it obviously is sort of a case-by-case thing. I think you can't rule it out. I mean, you cannot tell dictators around the world, go ahead, do what you want to your countries, do what you want to your neighbors. No risk from the US of military action, maybe some sanctions. I mean, that is going to lead to more people getting slaughtered, in my opinion. Doesn't mean we go in everywhere. It doesn't mean we're primed, at the drop of a hat, but I don't think we are. Again, the stories of the last 10 years have been mostly non-intervention. So Americans don't want to go to war. We're sitting here between the Atlantic and the Pacific, commercial country. It's not like people are really chafing at it's not the Roman Empire or something, or whatever, or a republic. But I think you can't rule out the use of military force if necessary, and including sometimes for humanitarian reasons, to stop genocide and slaughter, often for reasons of national interest. Often the two are mixed together.
Yeah, if anyone's curious about US actions in Rwanda, Ambassador Samantha Power has an incredible article called Bystanders to Genocide, an incredible summary of the inaction that the United States took in 1994, which directly led to 600,000 Tutsis being massacred. There were a lot of other reasons, but it's an incredible article. So I'm going to pivot back to the United States, if that's okay. A few people have been asking about a split in the Republican Party, which I think y'all can definitely speak to. I'm just curious, do you think that split is going to lead to the rise of a new Republican Party, a third party, a potential bipartisan coalition with the Democrats? Where do you think that this movement that you're a part of Republicans Against Trump, Republicans for Republican Accountability, what do you think that new movement is going to form itself into in the next few years?
Yeah, okay, so I'll take a first crack at this. So when we started, Bill and I kind of came together to try to figure out, what can we do as people who were both had careers in Republican politics, conservative circles, and we were like, we got to fight Trump from inside. We got to start these Republican organizations with all of and plant our flag and take Trump on. And I think our operating theory ultimately was, especially, thinking about Republican voters against Trump, was if you can demolish Trump in an election, right? If he is soundly rebuked, thoroughly repudiated, both Trump and Trumpism, then the Republican Party goes, okay, that wasn't good. Like, we're not going to do that again. Or if Trump had won for a second term, no doubt clear answer. Republican Party, wholly owned subsidiary of Trump Inc. And the problem is that we actually got a mixed bag. We didn't get a thorough repudiation, and obviously he wasn't elected, contrary to his belief. And so that leaves us, if he had been thoroughly repudiated, what there would have been is this real room for a fight for the soul of the Republican Party, where I think we would have really participated and sort of fought for a sane center-right party, which we believe is something that the country needs and is important, and something that sort of separates countries that go into full-blown autocracies from those that don't, is that they've got a viable center-right that sort of stands up and creates a broad pro-democracy coalition. I think because we got the mixed bag, and Bill can answer for himself, but I know that he and I are mostly aligned on this point. I think that the formation of a third party is not a good idea, and primarily because, look, that sane wing of the Republican Party is getting smaller all the time. There is a voter appetite problem, like it's a demand problem on the voter side, where they want much more of the pure uncut Trump, and no amount of insurrection or putting pressure on allies to investigate his opponent, none of that is going to matter. And that is a huge, scary thing. And I think that I have never seen in our country such a dangerous moment as the idea that Trump might get reelected. And for now, I think that, and it's not just, look, if Trump was a cancer, and I thought, wow, we could cut out that cancer and we can start to heal. But instead, he's metastasized. And now the entire Republican Party is not the entire Republican Party, but a large part of the Republican Party is bought in on a democracy-destroying lie, which is the election was not free and fair, that it was stolen from Donald Trump, that it was rigged. And that is Josh Hawley and Ted Cruz and Kevin McCarthy, who, if Republicans win again in 2022, would be the Speaker of the House. These are people who went on TV and said, fight, because this was stolen from you. They are lying to voters. And so that version of the Republican Party is dangerous, and it must be denied political power. And the idea that you would start a third party with this very small segment in the hopes that you would sort of either split the Republican Party or provide a home to centrists. Look, this would be a different situation if Bernie Sanders had won the nomination on the Democratic side, and there was suddenly this wide open pool of people kind of in the center who wanted to band together. That would be different. But Joe Biden won. He won their nomination and he won the election, and he is not, contrary to popular Tucker Carlson belief, like a radical socialist, lunatic, like the center held. And so I think for the future right now, the best thing to do for those of us who consider ourselves center-right or sort of conservative, but certainly pro-liberal democracy, is to help Joe Biden maintain that very fragile big tent that he built for this election that goes all the way from AOC and Bernie Sanders over here to Sarah Longwell and Bill Kristol, which is a crazy, unwieldy coalition, but it is one that is broadly pro-democracy, and that I think we need to hold off these, what the Republican Party has become, which is sort of dangerous and anti-democracy.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, it doesn't mean the Republican Party couldn't change. It doesn't mean that 5 years from now you couldn't imagine the formation of another party that replaces, hopefully, the Republican Party, as the Republicans did with the Whigs. But I think for now, Sarah put it very well, the center held. Those of us who think that's important need to help it hold longer and rebuild institutions and look at reforms that will strengthen the country and the culture and the society and our political process and the electoral process. There's done a fair amount of work on some of these because it's urgent to reform and to fix and to strengthen, not just to kind of hold on. But we do need for now, it's very important for the country for the center to hold.
So we've been speaking about national politics. I just wanted to return to one of the things that was brought up earlier when we were actually speaking about the idea of canceling Thanksgiving and the idea of cancel culture generally. There's a question from Miriam Shaw that I think is very related to that and very relevant for a university audience. interested in the idea, there's growing divisions occurring between the left and the right in the approach to literature and the arts and culture generally. On the right, there are people like Jordan Peterson and Sir Roger Scruton expounding on and exhorting the merits of the great books and the Western canon, whereas the left, there's a preoccupation and occupation with uplifting forgotten voices. So she wants to ask, and would also like to ask you, how do you think that we can recover a nonpartisan appreciation of the great books and Western canon and Western traditions as well, that have formed the backbone of American culture and society for centuries? And Western society for centuries as well.
And it's a very big question, and I'm generally on the conservative side of this, but I'd say also on the side that thinks things change, and the fact that certain people were read in 1950 doesn't mean that the judgments of 1950 were entirely correct, and some people were ignored and excluded. And I don't know, was Frederick Douglass read much at Penn probably in 1940? I'm a little doubtful, probably in your standard American political thought course. And is he worth reading? Absolutely. I actually taught a course, American Political Thought, I was thinking of it, with Frederick Douglass, with Booker T. Washington, who differed with Douglass somewhat, with Du Bois. That's not just diversity for diversity's sake. They're very important figures in American history. They address important things for not just for African Americans, but for all Americans. And I'd say the same on sort of Western literature course. I remember a friend of mine who teaches kind of the intro, literature course at a major state university, saying he had no problem accommodating, he started off with a kind of traditional syllabus, whatever was in those big fat Norton books that used to be assigned at least for those intro courses. But people said we need to be more diverse and representative. And he was very happy to teach many great female writers. I mean, some of his favorites, actually, Jane Austen, George Eliot, and others, great non-white writers. I think he taught V.S. Naipaul in one class, and other kind of anti-colonial, or Naipaul's complicated, maybe he's not anti-colonial, but Salman Rushdie is a very important writer. I mean, so I think a lot of this can be accommodated. And if people get nervous, some people on the left, you shouldn't say Western tradition, well, okay, maybe, I mean, there is such a thing, and historically, it'd be a little silly, I think, to pretend it doesn't exist, but should people just study that? No, I mean, I don't think so. I taught political philosophy, and I didn't teach Aristotle because he was Western. I taught him because he was a great thinker, and I'm perfectly happy to teach. It's hard, people like me aren't as familiar with other traditions, perhaps, but one of the great things about the Western tradition is that it's been open to fundamental debates, Athens and Jerusalem, different forms of government, ancients and moderns, and so forth. So it's not sometimes the conservatives have made the tradition too, I don't know what the right word is exactly, too uniform or unitary, you might say. And it has plenty of room to grow and to expand, and to teach contemporary writers and so forth. So I'm somewhere in between. I'm against the kind of excessive. I'm for a more traditional, great books oriented education, I guess. But I also think we will discover new great books that were neglected, and teach people who are radical. And I taught Nietzsche, I taught Marx. I didn't just teach good guy liberals when I taught the intro political philosophy course at Penn. Very important to take that, to take them seriously, not just as like, these guys are sort of bad guys. I mean, they're serious thinkers, great thinkers. What do we think of them? So I'm for good at, real liberal education. And I think we should be able to find our way towards that despite all the fighting from left and right.
Yeah, I guess I would just add to that. I'm super pro great books, and I think that it is like any question about speech. Typically, the answer is not less; it's more, and it is about. I just don't see those things as even remotely mutually exclusive, right? Like I get it that like sometimes you're like, okay, that's enough dead white guys for me. And like, there might be a limit on how many dead white guys like should be in any syllabus, but like, there's tremendous, like we should be, incorporating women that have been overlooked, people of color, people who are part of the Western tradition, and certainly part of American history. But that doesn't mean that you don't have to throw the other stuff out, right? It is not, I think, and I do think this is where in academia too, people run into problems where it has to be, you get rid of one to make room for the other, as opposed to being like, the best part about all of this is that like America and the West in general, like that we ask big questions and we force people to grapple with them. And that means reading all kinds of different people and not prioritizing one over the other or even siding with one over the other. Because that's not the point of an education. The point of an education is to force people to grapple with everything as deeply and as hard as they can so that they can make tough choices when they're contributing citizens.
So we've spoken about the issues with Trumpism and some of the new turns in the Republican Party. I'm going to turn that on its head a little bit and challenge you guys. I'm curious what positives that we could gain from Trump's philosophy and that can be adapted for the new Conservative Party. Are there any positive? If it's okay to say there aren't any positives, but I'm just curious, do you think it's all bad? Do you think there's elements that can be reformed? Because he appeals to a very large segment of the United States, and that's not going to necessarily go away in the next year or two. So I'm kind of curious about what we can learn from Trump's success, either to do better, I guess, as Americans, or to appeal to that demographic that often feels like they have been overlooked by mainstream politics.
I'll just say a word, and then Sarah could say more, I think, and better perhaps, since those focus groups have probably taught her more about, in a way, what Trump voters kind of care about and how one can appeal to them. We tried very hard to appeal to them on their own terms when we were doing Republican voters against Trump. We didn't berate them for having voted for Trump in 2016. We tried to persuade them, though, that they didn't want to give him a second term. It was risky and dangerous in certain ways and unwise in certain ways. I would say more broadly, when I edited the Weekly Standard from so let's just say from the end of the Bush administration, January 2009, and through the Obama years, we were pretty consistently worried that the party was too narrow in its views, too kind of economic determinist almost, too corporatist, not populist in a kind of healthy way, not reaching. We published Ross Douthat around Rights of the Times and Rahan Salam on Sam's Club Republicans as opposed to Country Club Republicans way back in 2005, I think. So I always had a sympathy to the sort of notion that the party was at risk of becoming too much an upper middle class, sort of country club party. It always had that risk, and Reagan had corrected that some and in his own way pushed a little bit. So I'm not against it's a democracy, and so a certain amount of populism is inevitable and healthy. You got to have the people on board, and educate them at the same time, some of them on some things at the same time that you accommodate their concerns and their wishes. I think with Trump, it just got so dangerous and damaging because of the grievance mongering and the, fostering of anxieties instead of trying to say, look, yes, your globalization has its problems, but here's what we're doing to deal with it. So I think some of the populism is reasonable to address, and some of the, I'd say that. I think that was something we were Reform Conservatives. That was a group called Reformicons in 2013, 2014, 15. And again, we very much concerned with sort of, it can't be what someone called at the time zombie Reaganism. We can't just be, let's relive the glorious 80s when Reagan cut tax rates. At some point, the problem really wasn't high tax rates in the US in 2013, 14, 15. The problems had much more to do with education, with healthcare. That requires government's very involved in those two sectors. Government's not going away. You could have dreams of a libertarian, healthcare system, or of 90% of the students in America not going to public schools, but it's not going to happen immediately. It doesn't mean you shouldn't have more school choice in charter schools. But you need to think about reforming the public provision of healthcare, the public provision of education. And so then there was some serious good work done, honestly, on reform efforts. Never really got political traction. People were busy fighting the Obama administration, basically. And then Trump came along. So there's kind of a whole reform agenda, conservative-ish reform agenda sitting there in a lot of areas that hasn't been, tried a little bit in the Bush years. They kind of got preoccupied with foreign policy after 9/11 and kind of ran out of steam. So it's been not sitting around, it's been worked on, but never really been at the center of anything for a long time. And so that would be a way, I think, to speak to people. Republicans can't just be the party of obviously defending the status quo.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that Trump did that I find interesting is that he did tap into grievance, but the grievance is not entirely unmerited. Like so I grew up in central Pennsylvania, and I talked to The focus group facility I use is like located in Pennsylvania, so we can get a lot of Pennsylvania attendees. Man, you should hear these people talk about the towns that they live in. And I know their towns. I've driven through those towns. If you go out to Western Pennsylvania, that used to be this thriving area in steel country, and that is just like bombed out nothingness. You know, they'll talk to you about how the only things coming to their areas are like Amazon fulfillment centers or Chewy's.com fulfillment centers. That, you know, they've watched their kids leave and there's no jobs where they are. And you go up north to like Erie, Pennsylvania, it's just gone. It's like a McDonald's and a diner and a gas station. And like, these used to be like places where the middle-class jobs were and people were working and they raised families there. And like, that desperation is real. Those people's lives matter too. And I think this is why Trump is so evil, is that he exploits that desperation, those desperate people, and he pits them against other desperate people. And they're both marginalized for different reasons in different ways. And he basically was like, no, you guys matter. I don't care about those other marginalized people. I care about you who live in those towns. And they do feel forgotten. They do feel like nobody has talked to them. They've seen their health care go up. They think that the way politicians talk, it's about other people that matter. They don't see like hope in reach about an economy coming back. And Trump just lied to them. Like, he just lied to them and said, like, we're going to restore manufacturing in your towns. We're going to bring this stuff back. And everybody was like, great. I'm voting for the guy who says he's going to bring my town back. And so the nostalgia element, some of it is like a 1950s, you know, women knew their place, white people were, but like some of it's that, but a lot of it is just like, I remember when my town was great. And I remember when like everyone lived here and like I could pay for my life on the job that I was making at the steel plant, and that's all gone. And like, there's nothing for their kids to do in those towns. Like, I think that Trump tapped into that. And I think that one of the things that made Joe Biden successful is that he thought about those people too. He included those people in who mattered to him and his agenda and his policies. And I think that anybody who's successful about building a broad coalition needs to think about not just including them in name, but like, what do we do about the fact that there are entire sections of the country that are just like drying up and disappearing? I haven't seen it yet. There's this movie Nomadland that's out right now that sort of has this idea about just these collapsing communities. And I think, you know, a lot of us live in the urban centers and so we just don't see it. And it really, it's real and it matters. And those people are looking for answers and help.
So a little bit of a follow-up on that. One of the things that can be blamed, I suppose, for the, not necessarily the cause of Trump's message, but the proliferation of it around the country is the hyper-partisanship of the news media and the idea of echo chambers. And that's not necessarily going to go away. An echo chamber is self-reinforcing. So I'm just curious how you think, both of you have worked in newspapers before and with online media. How do you believe that the media can and should shape the political conversation to avoid the aggressive side of partisanship that has led to issues such as the riot at the Capitol, potentially violent protests, etc.? So what role should the media play?
I mean, I have a very strong opinion on this out of the gate, which is it is less, to me right now, the problem with media is not just that it is hyper-partisan, though it is not just that it locks people in media silos, though it does. The problem is there are media organizations that tell you the truth and there are media organizations that lie to you. And so, and because like the social media, digital media, everything blew up the notion of gatekeepers. And so like, you can just start a thing and you can, like Alex Jones did, and you can be a raving lunatic who 20 years ago would have been relegated to a street corner, handing out pamphlets. You now have a show and a studio and can become a millionaire and peddle your lies and conspiracy theories. And like, that's just fine. And so, you know, I think that it is difficult when you are a free speech purist, which I am, but then to also grapple with, this isn't just about good speech, bad speech, left speech, right speech. It's about people who tell lies. I mean, what happened at the Capitol is built on lies. What Donald Trump does is lie to people. He tells them an election is stolen. They have to go fight for their democracy. Those people believe him. I mean, like, there's like some obscene proportion, 73% of Republicans think the election was rigged or stolen. that there was widespread voter fraud. And it is because there was an immediate ecosystem where there was both supply and demand. There was an electorate that demanded somebody tell them that their guy didn't lose, and to back up what he was saying because they believe him. And there was an OAN and a Newsmax, and people to the right of Fox were willing to be the supply. And because even Fox wasn't willing to do it. But now you can see as Fox loses market share, how it's like, actually, we don't want to lose to Newsmax and OAN. So we need to make sure, let's get rid of Martha McCallum. She said President-elect Biden won too many times, and replace her with Maria Bartiromo, who was a big, election truther. And so I think, anyway, the inability to, and people can't tell. I mean, doing the focus groups, man, the nihilism, for authoritarianism to take hold, nihilism is one of these prerequisites. And just the absence of, I just hear it all the time when people say, I don't know what to believe. I don't know what to believe. And that absence of truth is part of what's crippling us right now.
I think that's really an important point. I mean, Havel's written about this, and Gary Kasparov, our friend, talks a lot about this now. I mean, the dictators, the authoritarians, the demagogues, they don't really expect to persuade everyone of the truth of what they're saying. What they expect to persuade people is the truth's kind of unknowable. How can you tell? And therefore, why not go with me? I'm strong man kind of thing. People didn't necessarily believe in all these doctrines the dictators were pushing, but they didn't know what to believe. And sort of truth gets obliterated, the whole distinction of facts and fiction, truth and lie. And I do think we've gone further down that road than I really could have imagined, honestly. And I do think in that respect, January 6th is kind of a culmination. And the reaction to January 6th is very depressing, that people didn't say, oh my God, what were we doing? And that was all ridiculous anyway, this Dominion voting machines nonsense. And then look what it led to in practice. And let's pull back. But that's not really where people have gone. And so that's worrisome. I do think on social media, it's intensified it. I mean, Alex Jones might have been on a street corner, as Sarah says, 20 years ago. Maybe he would have been, if he were lucky, though, on a local talk radio station or a local newspaper or something, and had been able to get people to pay to come to his lectures. But even so, the effect of the demagoguery would have been limited, spatially, temporally. Just things were not shared the way they can be today, and so at scale and quite cheaply, which is good for those of us on the Zoom call, but bad in some ways for the country. And I do think. But the social media too, I do think we had a good piece on this in the Bulwark about a month ago, and I just don't know enough to know really how one would do this. But it can't just be a fact of life. It can't just be something that we have to accept without questioning, that the way the algorithms work, and this is especially, I think, true of Facebook, which is the pure kind of social media, that the more extreme, the longer you stay on, the more intensely you engage with something, the more that engagement is rewarded, or the thing that is engaged is rewarded, which means in effect that the more extreme, the more intense the experience is, the more it's favored by the algorithm. And you do end up, favoring craziness over somewhat boring, complex discussions of the facts. Is that always been the case? Of course, there's a reason people were concerned about demagogues in ancient Greece and in Florence in 1500 and in America. The founders were very concerned about this. And sensationalism has always been a way to sell newspapers. And the tabloids always sold more copies than the broadsheets. I mean, none of this is entirely new, but I do think social media has taken it to a new level in a sense where you can't really check it. You don't even know what's going on. It really is siloed in a kind of almost literal sense, that if you're not part of this particular, circle, so to speak, you don't even see the material, and stuff gets sent around, and something like QAnon can go from just a ludicrous, tiny, what assumes small, crazed conspiracy to pretty large numbers of people. And it does real damage, leave aside the politics, just to people's lives. So the anti-vaxxer stuff, I've been struck by that, as we've all been so focused on the pandemic. I mean, that's again something I thought, well, I guess there's one or two guys I've heard of who push that, and then I guess there's some people who believe it, but I mean, come on. But then it turns out, an awful lot of that seeps into many more people's thinking and sense of things than one would have expected. So I think it's a bigger problem, and I mean, it will require cultural changes, educational changes, but I think practical changes, especially in some of these things, in the way social media is organized, the incentive system of social media, which again, those are things that can be changed. As a conservative, I'd be nervous. As a free speech person, I'd be nervous about, taking a really heavy hand to changing them. But it can't just be that it's sort of, we can't do anything about it.
I guess my next question is a direct follow-up on that. What should we do? I mean, I'm a strong believer in free speech, and yet all of my social media channels are essentially echo chambers given how algorithms work. Should we regulate the media? Should we do what Instagram is now doing and provide fact checks on posts, but allow the posts to still be seen? What do you think is the ideal path forward to keep this fake news from resulting in another episode such as the riot at the Capitol and from QAnon spreading across the country?
I'll just say a word. Maybe Sarah's got more to say on this. I just don't know enough to really know exactly how to do it. But if you think about it, in the old days, if you were a fervent right-winger and you thought John McCarthy was right, there was a newspaper you could buy in 1950 that went along with McCarthy's claims of communism. There wasn't a whole system where you would suddenly be getting reinforcement 24/7 from all your friends who were buying equivalent, or not even buying because it's free, getting equivalent documents and fake news and claims, and then they're getting parroted. Here's where Fox News does play a pretty big role. And then they show up on TV. So it's not just something I just seeing online from my cranky uncle, it's actually, it's on TV. I think Sarah's probably heard that a lot in the focus groups, right? So that kind of gives it a sort of stamp of semi-legitimacy at least. But again, the way the algorithms work, whether you should own your own information, so to speak, instead of passively letting Facebook decide what you see, right? You go out to a newsstand in the old days, or you subscribe, you decide what paper you want, right? That's not the way Facebook works, when you think about it, right? Facebook feeds you, and it's a good verb. The verb is a good, gives you that, conveys the image, right? What the algorithm has decided you want. It's a little different, honestly. This is where I think Google, if you just think of the different social media platforms, Google's a little different. There's a little bit of the algorithms throwing up on the first page when you do a search, what it thinks you're more interested in. And obviously YouTube is telling you what you're interested, recommending things you're interested in, but it's a little different from the way than Facebook, which strikes me as uniquely powerful in a way and uniquely problematic. And so far as, if you think of the Facebook equivalent, you would walk out to your newsstand and the news agent would say, this is what you're going to get. And furthermore, after you finish this, you're going to get this, which is an even more extreme version of this. And, and you don't almost have a choice. I'm exaggerating a little. So anyway, I think that's got to be serious. People have to look at that as a public policy question.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think nobody knows what to do about it, because if anybody did, they'd be a bajillionaire selling it to, they get Mark Zuckerberg to fund it to help him redeem himself. I think there's sort of two things, though, that I think about. One is, I saw a tweet once that I've never forgotten because I think it's so true, which is somebody said, social media has done to our parents' brains what they always said television would do to us. And I do think that there is something about the older generation that is not native to a lot of social media, where it is so there's just like not the same level of discernment. They haven't grown up with it, so there's more like, oh, well, my friend said this, and so now I believe it's true. Whereas I think that people who are more native, I'm from a generation that's like right in 1980, so I both grew up without the internet, but then got it when I was sort of young enough to be like young and have the internet. So I've like sort of had it my whole semi-adultish life. And so I think that will change things, just as people who are native to the internet grow up and are more discerning, understand the platforms, understand the algorithms, know they're being manipulated. Like the understanding of being manipulated is probably the first. What is it? Knowing is half the battle. That's like one of the first steps. The other thing I would say is that like there's always regulatory answers. To me, it is not the first tool we should reach for in our toolbox. I do think there's a ton we can do socially and culturally. I think Mark Zuckerberg's feeling not great about himself these days, right? I do think that there's a lot of pressure to be like, you are ruining the country with this thing. Like, you need to fix it. Some of it too, and by fix it, some of it is like, enforce your terms of service, right? So like Twitter, one of the things Twitter is dealing with is like, they deplatform the president. The president has been violating their terms of service in terms of abusive language the whole time he's been on it. And like, they ran into a real problem with both well, how do we start enforcing it now when he's president of the United States? And also, what do we do if we enforce it for him? We've got to enforce it for everybody, and then it looks selective and biased. And so I think that these companies have to start taking their terms of service seriously, and so that people kind of are playing by the rules culturally. And if you want to be in a platform that's a free-for-all, you know that it's a free-for-all, and that's fine, but like that's obviously going to be a different platform. So I don't know. I think there's some of those things that can matter.
And on that first point, I think it's so true. People my age have much more trouble, much more credulous. People a little older, even more so, honestly, in terms of, oh, I saw this was printed something. This was some news site. Well, it wasn't news because it says newssite.com doesn't mean it's a reputable news site. It could be some Russians or some crazy people, but hey, someone's cut and pasted it and sent it to me in my email, and it looks reputable to me. I actually think young people are much better naturally at this, and I'm more hopeful about young people. It's a funny irony, right? All the oldsters my age complaining, oh, you young people don't study the Western canon and tradition, and you're all, going off in this. But in fact, it's the old people who have been taken in by so much more online, more credulous for all of that. They allegedly studied all these things, in college. They turned out to be the ones who really fell for this stuff, I think, more than young people. So some of that might sort itself out just because younger people are more understanding of what's happening.
I'm back. Great. Sorry, I live in campus housing. My Wi-Fi is temperamental. I just wanted to end, since we only have 3 minutes left, I guess a bit more on a positive note. I was just wondering what advice the two of you each could give to my generation, to all the people on this call, for keeping up the standards of American democracy against those who would do harm to it, and living good, civically active lives as American citizens and as those who live within America as well. What advice do you have for us? I know that's kind of a very large question, but what advice do you have?
Okay, listen, live your life as an optimist. Like, one of the things that drew me to conservatism, I should have answered this way out of the gate, is because it felt like the more optimistic of the two philosophies, right? It said, America is a great place, and America is a great place. We have all kinds of problems, but like I said before, because of our structure, because of what's built into our fabrics, we are the best at solving these things. Like, we will figure it out. When I was 25, in 2005, that was when the first gay marriage passed in Massachusetts. When I was graduated from college in 2002, I never even occurred to me I could get married. Like, once I came out, I was like, I'm never going to be able to get married. Like, and I'm just going to have to hide this. And like, the whole world changed because people went out and told the truth about who they were. And American democracy was built to change institutions over time as the culture changed. So like, don't let people tell you that, and don't give up on institutions just because like they were founded in a way that you don't. That's like the whole American experiment was founded with all kinds of things that were problematic. It's all problematic. Be an optimist. Think about tomorrow. Push forward and make things better. And when you think about like being a good steward of American democracy, it is about like believing that the fundamentals and the tools are there to make things better, and like be a participant in utilizing the tools available to us as Americans because of American democracy to help it fulfill its promise. It is a more perfect union. The goal is always to make it more perfect, right? It's not perfect. That's the whole deal. That's my advice.
I think it's a good thing to end on. That was excellent. Very well said.
Awesome. Thank you guys both for spending this time with us, with Penn, with Philo, with the Andrea Mitchell Center, and just with the SNF Paideia Program. We appreciate everything that you've shared with us. It's always a pleasure to speak to people who've had such incredible careers and talk to them like a person, which is always, it's amazing. It turns what we learn in classes into practice, and it reminds us why we do what we do.
Thank you, Kelly. You did an excellent job, if I could say, in moderating this, and it's really been a pleasure.
Absolutely.
Alrighty.